the program. You have No Din Ziem's personal and political flaws that are crippling, ultimately, to the program. I think Tom makes some excellent observations here about the pitfalls of dealing with the Ziem regime. He writes, had Ziem been able to articulate a constructive political program and been able to build the administrative machinery to implement it, he might have succeeded in the long term. But his reliance on family and personal loyalties to project his authority, together with the arbitrary quality of his governing style, reduced almost to nil the prospects of American-sponsored institution building and political reform. But the problem here is that he's the only game in town. And there's a sense here of a binary situation. It's either the communists or Ziem. We must side with Ziem because the alternative is even worse. And when this tendency to fail to view any alternatives or to really understand the dynamics by which Ziem's rule is perceived as illegitimate and why the communists have an appeal in the countryside, you have the whole edifice of intelligence activities there, the nation building and the pacification programs, falling apart. There's also the issue of success-induced optimism. The agency was on a roll in the early 50s. We had had success in the Philippines in putting down the hooks and getting Magsaysay in power. We had success, and the British had done pretty good in Malaysia in a not quite similar circumstance. We had our own successes in Iran in '53 and Guatemala in '54. So this is high times for the agency. And the idea that you could pick up a successful operational method and move it to another part of the world was an obvious lesson to us in retrospect, but something that people were not thinking about terribly much during that period of time. There are also problems on a sort of the intelligence tactical level after we leave these broad issues here. One is we don't have a lot of good intelligence sources inside North Vietnam and the Viet Cong infrastructure. In fact, we have precious few. There are occasional defectors, but a lot of that was engaged in disinformation. We don't have good signals intercepts. We're really not very smart about what's going on up in the north, and even so in the south where the Viet Minh were. So how are we to accurately gauge what we need to do and whether anything we're doing is actually having any effect? We're relying on liaison information, which is always dubious. There are agendas, there are security issues, there are problems of vetting the sources, and we don't really have a good fix. We're relying oftentimes on a cadre of CIA case officers who are inexperienced. They're doing 1- and 2-year tours out in the field. They come from other operational milieus and experiences. They don't know the place terribly well. And they're trying to import the institutional knowledge to this very alien environment and not having terrific success at it. And lastly, if we move beyond Ziem and start talking about the generals who succeeded him, this is Big Min here who took over in '64, the basic problem here is that lacking an overall cohesive strategy about how to do these things, we are, in effect, on the fly all the time. We're improvising, we're making it up as we go along. Now, this was one of the things that the agency was pretty good at, was putting out fires and coming up with quick fixes. It was one of our skills that we developed and brought to us from the old OSS days. But out in the field, it meant things were haphazard, uncoordinated. Local successes could not be expanded much further, and even if they were usually co-opted or corrupted by the central government. And a third problem here is changing missions. You can't have a long-term covert action program if your mission is constantly changing, because that means your targets, your methods, and the whole purposes for which you're doing these things are variable. But listen to this sequence of events that starts beginning after the generals take over. First, covert action is there to stabilize the junta, stop the revolving door. Well, okay, that kind of took care of itself after a while, then we're now in place to legitimize the two regime, to support his so-called election to power and then to prettify the regime after that. Then, after we start moving towards some kind of truce or peace settlement, the agency is heavily involved in trying to push him to support the settlement that we're trying to negotiate and impose on him. And lastly, after the settlement is reached, the agency's main focus is tidying things up, putting things in boxes and getting them out of the country as quickly as we can, in effect an organized demobilization of the agency there. So when all of these things are changing constantly, you can't have a systematic and cohesive covert action and intelligence regime over there. No surprise that there were disconnects, that there were problems. One thing we can definitively put to rest, though, if anybody still thinks that there was anything to this canard, is that the CIA was behind the November coup that led to the death of ZM. This is demonstrated in Tom's book on the ZM relationship. There's absolutely no formally classified documentation to support any allegation whatsoever. The problem arises here, and we saw this happening again in 1973 with the coup in Chile, is when you're in a situation for intelligence collection purposes, that is, you want to know what the regime dissidents are doing, the fact that you don't stop them from doing the thing that ultimately happens suggests that you're lending it a tacit approval. This was not the case from the period of August to November '63. Certainly before then, as you well know, there were prominent people in the Kennedy administration who wanted ZM out. The agency was not one of them. We had people there knowing what was going on, but we were not pushing it. We were simply helping the people understand the dynamic. We had absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with the events that occurred between August and November '63 that led to the death of ZM. Now, when we turn to the pacification programs, we want to understand, again, an important fact that when the overall dynamic of pacification changes periodically, and Tom has identified 6 periods of pacification. And by pacification, again, we're talking about this kind of hearts and minds idea. You go out into the countryside, you win the loyalty of the peasantry through civic action, through good works, through protection from the Viet Cong. You do it in a variety of ways, economic benefits and providing security. But as you can see from this sequence of events here, the target, the mission, the focus is changing over time. And when you compound that with the rotation of case officers in and out, changing cues from the top, you can see that it's no wonder covert action pacification in Vietnam is one of the most confusing stories to try to tell. And it, too, as we mentioned with the nation building, is founded on some basic misconceptions. One of them, perhaps the most fundamental one, is the persistent idea that there was no legitimate reason why the rural peasantry would not support the ZM regime. The fact that we thought the Viet Cong were in there through terror, through violence, through coercion. And once we establish security, that's not going to happen anymore. And then when you start throwing in the great American economic benefits, the handouts, the material goods, the health care, the schools, the tractors, etc., combine that all with the overt aid that is going out to the peasantry through USAID and organizations like that, how could they not love us? How could they not support us? The problem is we need to persuade them that there's a reason to fight on behalf of the central government, of the ZM government. And so we'll do that by winning their loyalties through these kinds of benefits and security. And then they'll forsake their bigger loyalties, as we now know, to family and village, and there won't be any reason why the VC can make any inroads there whatsoever. Tying this in occasionally with the government's programs like strategic hamlets and such, so it becomes a kind of a pastiche of different programs and different benefits. We did have some localized successes. the civilian irregular defense groups were highly successful when run on a small scale by the agency. They later on became militarized and were scattered around the country, and consequently there was no connection between the village defense force and defending the village. Instead, they're just out there fighting the war on behalf of the government they don't like. Needless to say, this program kind of fell apart. People's action teams, a similar kind of notion, local militia security. Again, once it becomes nationalized and the people are detached from the point of it all, protect the village, and they're moved elsewhere in the country, the loyalty is lost, the effort to gain the loyalty is lost. So the sad thing about pacification, and it may have been a built-in dynamic in the whole program, is the more successful they got, the more likely they were to fail. Because the localized success could not be kept localized. The oil slick idea, as you spread out your areas of control, that attracted the attention of the central government, and it also made for more and easier targets for the VC. So there's a bizarre paradox in here, as the quotation from one of our case officers early on suggests. It might have all been hopeless, but something had to be done. There was no other way to get around it. The problem, as we've described a bit, is that built into this overall architecture of covert action are some very, very difficult obstacles to success. A lack of agreement between what the whole point of it was. We're out there to legitimize a government that is doing things that undermine its legitimacy. We're trying to get the government to change its whole notion of social justice through efforts at land reform, through efforts at winning the peasants' loyalty, and they're simply not interested in doing that. And it's no better, of course, under the general's regime after '64. So that paradox of nation building, a reactionary status quo government that won't change, but the only way to promote peasant loyalty is to get it to change. And our programs are often working at cross purposes. Some of the other points up there are pretty self-evident, but this is a key, I think, here as well. The metricalization of the war, the body counts, the numbers of equipment killed, the amount of acreage under control. As we get into a more quantified basis for results determination, the same thing happens with pacification. It's no longer measuring hearts and minds, which were always tough to measure anyway. It's how many villages can you claim, and what's the metric, to control. As you can see, we weren't making a whole lot of progress here between '63 and '67. The red areas designate communist control, the blue represent government control. If anything, control is somewhat evaporating more from the government than from the communists. There is a battle for loyalty in the countryside, and we are making occasionally isolated progress, but it's by no means a definite trend, and in some ways it's working in just the opposite. Also, not being coordinated with military operations. One of the problems that beset agency activities over there is bureaucratic rivalries among the military, the agency, the State Department, and some internal infighting within the agency itself between field officers, headquarters personnel, analysts trying to explain it all, covert action operators versus counterintelligence officers. There's a lot of elbowing inside the CIA itself, and that became crippling in certain circumstances. And over the long run, this is, as Tom makes this rather dismal conclusion here, by the end of the war, all we're trying to do is stop losing as quickly as we were in the countryside. In short, according to official agency history, the whole pacification program had probably an inbuilt design for failure. It would have been very tough looking back on this to see any potentials for success because of the regime that we were dealing with. Now that said, I have heard scholars who've read Tom's book, complain that he's too critical of the South Vietnamese government, and he lets the agency off the hook a little bit too much. Those are reasonable criticisms, I think, to be made. But overall, I do accept his general perspective on things. We talked already a little bit about the infiltration operations, taking either singleton or team groups of agents and dropping them behind enemy lines by air, by sea, by land. We did this 36 times between 61 and 63 when this program began. By the time we turned it over to the military, we could, at best, with hopes and prayers, recommend maybe 4 or 5 of these agent teams or individuals as having possible active utility. We often lost communication with these people as soon as they hit the ground. We had evidence that they were being doubled. Oftentimes, we just never heard from them again. The military's response was, well, let's just beef it up, keep trying harder, send in more teams. Overall, a few hundred South Vietnamese agents were lost in the course of this program. And why did it happen? Why was this so persistent? It goes back to a long record of conducting these kinds of black operations from World War II, where they were relatively successful around the margins. But we were dealing with a benign operating environment, existing resistance groups we could connect with, people who wanted to help us. We're not finding that anywhere in the North to speak of, which is why these teams were just dropped, in effect, into black holes. A very, very costly and tragic kind of operation. A quick bit about analysis before we move into the Sihanoukville controversy. There are a handful of general analytic issues that the agency was straight up about. They told the truth to power, as the cliche likes to say it. They went against the grain. They went to the White House and said, in effect, you're losing the war the way you're prosecuting it. You need to do something different. That's the bottom line of our analysis. We're not prescribing the policy. That's not our job, but that's what our analysis is telling the Johnson White House, including even the whole philosophical foundation of it. We're not finding circa 65, 66 evidence that the domino theory even pertains. Needless to say, the White House isn't listening. And one of the problems is that our record, truth be told, was relatively mixed on analysis as well. There were some serious blown calls, missed calls on important analytic issues, things like the Tet Offensive that you're quite familiar with, some that perhaps are less well known in the literature. And the one I'd like to focus on a little bit, because it provides a very good case study for how to think about these issues, is the Sihanoukville controversy. Where are the South Vietnamese communists getting most of their weapons? Are they coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as we were insisting, or were they coming through the port of Sihanoukville in Cambodia, as the military was arguing? Neither side had definitive evidence, and they became wedded and entrenched in their positions. Part of this was bureaucracy, part of this was just dang stubbornness. But looking at it from the agency's standpoint, in Tom's very good book on the question, we find some serious issues here identified on the slide. And analysts at the agency learn from these kinds of studies all the time. We use books like Tom's in our training classes for analysts, just as we use some of these books in training for our field operators. The idea that lacking solid evidence, you come up with models or interpretations, or you look at things in the rational actor mode. Well, if I were them, I'd do it this way, so it must be happening, right? You look for sketchy evidence and build architecture around that. And pretty soon, the whole thing collapses like a house of cards, because we don't have the definitive evidence until the late 60s, when we start getting better sources inside Cambodia who are telling us really what's going on. And the key source doesn't come out until 1970. We get a warehouse man in Sihanoukville who, in effect, gives us the record books. And there it is. Proof positive, we were wrong. CIA was wrong on this call. The military was right. Do we get any credit in the Nixon White House for fessing up and saying, sorry, Mr. I can't stand the CIA president, we were wrong. But here's the proof, and go with it. This became a political disaster for the CIA because we got no credit for finally getting that good source inside Cambodia. Instead, what about Sihanoukville was a quote, was a question that Nixon regularly posed in NSC meetings. When we would come there with analysis that went against what he was thinking, he'd say, why should I believe you? What about Sihanoukville? And political implications, this is when our relationship with the White House really started to go down the tubes. Nixon came in with all sorts of predilections against CIA, social snobbery, crypto-liberalism, soft on the commies, all of this. That's what he thought about us when he came in. He used to think that we had helped him lose the election in 1960 by secretly giving information to JFK that he could use in the debates, and Nixon couldn't respond to it properly. Well, that never happened, but he took these resentments with him into the White House. And this was just another nail in the agency's coffin as far as he was concerned. Tom is also very good in describing the analytic techniques that were used. Now, I will say, when you look at this book, you will find it, I'm sorry to say, heavily redacted in a lot of areas, just blank page after blank page. I was quite upset about this when I saw what our people had done to it. They, I think, misinterpreted the idea of protecting sources and methods to taking out anything having to do with the way analysts do their work. They'll leave the conclusions in, they'll talk about the evidence, but you know, the black box inside the skull, they decided they didn't want to talk about. I regret that. But there's enough of the story left that I think you can learn quite a bit from it. A not terribly well-known analytic controversy that had major impact for our stature here. This is a good story, however. And maybe that's why Tom just couldn't stop writing about it. But it's the biggest one of the whole series. The covert action in Laos, we've heard about it referred to here and there, the cork in the bottle, the thing that bothered Eisenhower much more when he handed the baton to Kennedy than Vietnam. It's a fascinating tale about how to run a successful long-term paramilitary program using a proxy army that you, in effect, buy and pay for and help supply. Our biggest covert action program until Afghanistan in '79 to the late '80s, and very effective in doing what it was intended to do in Laos, which is keep it neutral. We are here because the military cannot be after '62 with the Geneva Agreement. Foreign forces will be removed from Laos. Well, the communists didn't quite hear that and didn't abide by it. They stayed. What are we going to do? We support the Hmong, the Mayo, as a proxy army, along with some other tribes here and there, depending on where you were in the country. This worked. We kept the country out of the communists' hands, and as the Vietnam War ramps up, this becomes a kind of a sideshow to interdict supplies on the trail, to do road watching operations. It becomes an important place to kind of get an angle on what the communists are doing in the South. So a very, very good program, and it bespeaks some of the more positive accomplishments of the agency. Here, unlike Vietnam, we had a better fix on the local cultural terrain. We understood the people. We had won their loyalties, and we kept it. It was an effectively administered program, good tradecraft, a good case study on how to do it right. And one of the most interesting tales about it, already known courtesy of William O'Leary, but a little bit extra comes out through the recent declassification, is the role of Air America in Laos. And we'll turn to that for a little bit. For those of you who aren't familiar with Air America, this was the CIA's aviation proprietary company, a secret company, a front company, if you want to call it that we assumed control of. It was originally called Civil Air Transport, which was a spin-off from the retirees from Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, who decided to stay over there and set up their own aviation activity. That started in '49. Civil Air Transport does some very important things for intelligence purposes, including helping drop relief supplies into Dien Bien Phu. During the 6 weeks before Dien Bien Phu fell, Civil Air Transport flew almost 700 supply missions, airdropping materiel, as is shown in this painting here. The pilot of this aircraft, James McGovern, nicknamed Earthquake Magoon, was shot down during this particular mission. This is a painting that appears in CIA headquarters. Overall, Civil Air Transport was an indispensable to the prosecution of the Laotian covert action. And you should know that in the course of Civil Air Transport's existence, it ceased in 1975, 240 Air America pilots and crewmen were killed. Now, we have a wall of honor at CIA headquarters, which now contains 90 stars, 1 star per killed in action in an intelligence mission. But these are staffers and overt, that is, known contractors. Proprietary employees don't get a star on the wall. These individuals are honored at the University of Texas at Dallas, where the Air America archives and a museum and a library are located. But they didn't have any overt connection to us until most recently, when, with this declassification effort described in this co-published book, that we did identify specific individuals as working for Air America and acknowledge their individual connection with CIA. Another thing that we can now acknowledge is the involvement in Air America with search and rescue missions in South Vietnam and Laos. Oftentimes, pilots would ditch in Laos and they had to be rescued. More often, they, of course, ditched in hostile territory in Vietnam. The military didn't have, initially, search and rescue capability. Air America did this, in effect, voluntarily. They were not ordered to do it. They signed on to do it. It was what's referred to as the Airman's Bond, the community of aviators helping out one another. And during this 1-year period, almost 24 of those missions are flown. After that, nobody's keeping track of them. All we know is that dozens and dozens of downed U.S. aviators were rescued through Air America, flying either helos or short takeoff and landing aircraft. And you saw a couple of those in the previous slide. We can also now talk about Air America's involvement in some heroics at Lima Site 85, which was a forward air navigation post way up in northern Laos, about 120 miles away from Hanoi. This was used for forward air traffic control for bombing missions into the north. There were 16 U.S. Air Force technicians stationed there, undercover as Lockheed Aircraft Corporation employees. And they were the ones running this little tiny primitive-looking listening post on top of a 5,600-foot tall mountain right there in the cusp of enemy territory. And they're there doing their business to help the pilots.
What year is this? What year?
This is throughout the 1960s. Okay. And the activity at Lima 85, or Site 85 that I'm going to talk about, starts in 66 to 68 when the North Vietnamese start going after it to try to take it out of business, because they're realizing something's going on up there. Starting in 66, well, let's just start the story, they begin shelling it, shooting at it, mortaring it. And during one of these very interesting episodes, you have, as far as I know, the only instance in aviation history in which a helicopter shot down a fixed-wing aircraft. In fact, it did it twice. This is an Air America helicopter flying reconnaissance and relief to Site 85. The North Vietnamese are flying these slow bi-wing aircraft to strafe and drop, literally just drop artillery shells onto the site. The helicopter happens to be there. The co-pilot sticks an AK-47 out the window, out the door, and shoots down both of these slow-moving fixed-wing aircraft. It's the only time I'm aware that this ever happened in aviation history. A couple years later, in 1968, at Site 85, the communists become determined to close this down. And so they not only begin their usual shelling, but they also start climbing up the mountain. And so Air America is called in to rescue these individuals because it's pretty clear this is going to get closed down. So we have helicopters there picking up some of the Air Force technicians. Regrettably, 10 of them are still missing in action to this day. We only were able to rescue 4 at the time. One of them was in the helicopter, was shot by ground fire, and died later. So we were only able to pull out 3 of them. 2 of our paramilitary officers tried to scale up. They were based over here, and they went down because a couple of the technicians were hiding out on the mountainside here, hoping to avoid what was going on up top, because the communists were coming in from over here and were scaling up in various hidden places. So they were hiding out over here in the rocks. A couple of our PM officers go out there and try to rescue them. They wind up getting caught under fire and in turn are rescued out by an Air America helicopter. Previously, we couldn't talk about the agency connection with any of this, but it's now officially acknowledged. And at the end, Air America is playing an important role. Not flying the A-12, but let me get us back here. There we go. About 1,000 rescue missions are being flown by Air America during the evacuation of Saigon. An estimated 41,000 evacuees are brought out of Saigon and environs through Air America operations during the drawdown in the latter months. And in the very last days or so, about 1,000 valued Vietnamese and others are taken out on the very last day. 1,000 are rescued through Air America, flying the STOLs and helicopters out to aircraft carriers offshore. And the most famous photograph of the evacuation, the so-called, and you'll still see this in books that ought to know better, the U.S. military aircraft on the roof of the U.S. Embassy taking people out. The famous one that you've seen with people scurrying up the ladder and the individual holding out his hand to pull them on board. Take that photograph, turn it sideways, and here's what you see. First, it's the Pittman apartment building in Saigon, which was one of a number of prearranged evacuation points. So this is not serendipitous, this is deliberate. Second, look at the tail of a helicopter. It's an Air America helicopter doing this. And thirdly, you can't see him in this photograph, the agency officer, well, I just blew the line. The person reaching out his hand is a CIA paramilitary officer whose cover has just been rolled back. So his involvement in all this can now be acknowledged. Let's switch to something a little more exotic in aircraft terms. The A-12, the Archangel 12 as it was called, better known by its code name Oxcart, which was chosen deliberately. This aircraft flies almost 2,200 miles an hour at 90,000 feet for 3 and 4 hours straight with refueling. So, chosen deliberately, ironically, the code name Oxcart. This was designed to be the successor of the U-2, and it came into design phase in the late 50s when we were expecting the U-2 program would eventually have to be ended because eventually the Soviets would shoot down one. Well, they did in 1960, but by then we didn't have an aviation replacement for it. We had the satellites soon coming online, but we were still pursuing the possibility of using such an aircraft for reconnaissance missions. By the time it's operational in 65, 66, obviously we're not going to overfly the Soviet Union. There's no real good place to use it except in East Asia, and most specifically in Southeast Asia. So a couple of years ago, when I was working on the book that came out of this particular project, we also got a lot of stuff declassified. I'm going to show you a few pages of the thousands that were there. This is a mission log of all the flights of the A-12 that was flown. It only lasted for 1 year, May 67 to 68. A total of 29 missions flown, and 26 of them are in Southeast Asia. 24 over North Vietnam, 2 in the tri-border region down by the DMZ. The other 3 related to North Korea had to do with the seizure of the Pueblo. I won't talk about them. This is the recently declassified mission map for the first time we sent the A-12 in. And here's how the program worked. You were forward deployed at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. That's the place where we set up in order to run these missions. Huge infrastructure. Talk about tail to tooth. This is a very long tail, but a very interesting tooth at the front of it. The plane would fly out, and I can talk about some of the peculiarities of the aircraft offline. It's a fascinating engineering story. It flies off, gets its tanks topped off, swings through North Vietnamese territory, takes its pictures, swings around, gets refueled in Thailand to get back to Kadena Air Base. That's how the basic mission went. This is the overall mission plot from Okinawa through, and this is a more specific picture of where it went on that first mission. Why was it there? There was a lot of concern at this time that the North was deploying surface-to-surface missiles. Where are they? This is a drastic escalation of the war. We need to find out, how can we get there? Not with the U-2. Soviet SAMs can shoot those down, obviously. They've done it a couple times already. The Chinese had already taken out a few as well. Satellites won't work. Unlike Hollywood, you can't stop a satellite in mid-orbit, turn it, have it take a picture, and then move on. It just doesn't work that way. So what's left? The A-12, and off it goes. Typical image. Lots of these are now declassified. You can see this is taken from 80,000 feet. Here's the air base. We developed a special photographic processing facility in Japan so we could get these things turned around and back to the battlefield within 24 hours. They used to have to be taken out of the airplane, shipped to Kodak in Rochester, which made the film and knew how to do it right, then sent down to Washington, where the photo interpreters, or squints as we used to call them, looked at the stuff. Then their analysis is shipped out via cable to Vietnam. This is very slow intelligence in a war situation. So having this place up in Japan was essential for getting this type of information in the hands of the warfighters and the decision makers. During the course of the missions, 29 of them, the aircraft was shot at 6 times by surface-to-air missiles. On only one occasion, when one of them blew up, did a fragment of the missile ever touch the aircraft. Routinely, during the life of the A-12 and the SR-71, if they saw an incoming SAM, they could usually just hit the afterburner and outrun it. This thing could fly amazingly fast. At its extreme, it was going 2,300 miles an hour. This is faster than most rifle bullets. And it could do it for a few hours at a time. And from our standpoint of understanding Vietnam, very important intelligence gathered. We dispensed with the SSM concern and just got a lot of good routine, if you will, photographic intelligence about places to bomb, what happened after they were bombed, where are the SAM sites. There would have been a lot more pilots shot down, I can guarantee you, if we hadn't known as much about the SAM sites as we got from the A-12 and other reconnaissance aircraft as well. So an extremely valuable program, dispensed with after 1 year because the Air Force took it over. You couldn't have bureaucratically, budgetarily, 2 parallel programs. The covert CIA program and the overt military SR-71 program doing the same thing in the same place. Something had to go, and guess who lost the bureaucratic battle? So the Air Force kept their SR-71s, which continued to fly until 1989 when the program was closed down. Last subject I'll talk about real quickly because it remains a matter of controversy and of current interest with all the talk about domestic surveillance and the global war on terror, NSA listening to our cell phone calls, hacking into our computers, and various sorts of espionage operations going on against U.S. citizens who are suspected of terrorism. This all sounds vaguely familiar to agency historians, and I'm sure some of you too, because we've been here before. The MH Chaos program sounds just like something out of a Len Deighton thriller, doesn't it? I'm told this was a random codename choice, but I'm a little dubious about that assertion. I don't think MH Cheese would have flown. These code names are supposedly generated randomly on a list, and you just pick the next one that comes up when your operation has to be named. I have a feeling somebody jumped the line here to get chaos attached. But what's going on here? This became one of the most important criticisms of CIA during the mid-1970s when, as I'll show you, this was disclosed. This was the reason why we were investigated by the Church Committee, this and some other exposures. But it was not, as has sometimes been misportrayed, a freelance operation. Like a bunch of guys sitting out at Langley didn't have anything else to do one day and said, hey, let's go spy on some anti-war protesters. We don't do our business that way. We got the order from both the Johnson and the Nixon White Houses to do this because they didn't believe such a robust anti-war movement could exist in the U.S. without foreign support and assistance. Go find it. Now, here's where the important distinction needs to be made. Spying on Americans by the CIA can be legitimate in certain circumstances. If, for example, you are concerned about an American doing something overseas that is suspect, possibly a legal violation, and you're asked to find out about it through foreign intelligence sources, agents in that country, listening in to communications, whatever the technique, that is a legitimate use of foreign intelligence sources. So when we were originally trying to figure out if any of these types of people were getting any support from China, Soviet Union, North Korea, Algeria, Soviet bloc countries, we used our assets and our capabilities in those countries to see what Americans were doing. That's a legitimate use of our capabilities. The problem is when we didn't find evidence of foreign support and reported that first to Johnson and then continued to report it to Nixon, they said, be a little more creative. And so we take this super secret program. I mean, you can imagine the political sensitivity this would have if it were exposed back then, let alone a few years later. It's put in the most secretive component of the CIA, the service within a service, the counterintelligence staff run by the notorious but quite misunderstood James Angleton, sometimes referred to as James Jesus Angleton with the emphasis on the middle name for some reason. But it wasn't his program. He didn't dream it up. He didn't have day-to-day dealings with it. It was put there specifically for security reasons. What did it find? It was a very busy program, as you can see here. Lots of collection, lots of file building, lots of interaction with other organizations. Most of the material that came out of the Chaos program was collected by others. As you well know, the NSA collects far more voluminous intelligence than the CIA does, so much of what we were getting from here was electronic snooping. But here's the concern. After that point at which we didn't find the foreign connection through the foreign intelligence approach, the president says, look harder. And here we have one of the most difficult decisions that any director of Central Intelligence I know of has ever had to make. Do I violate the CIA's charter or not? Because doing what he was now being ordered to do is illegal. Helms's rationale was, first, I'm not going to go rat to the press. I'm not that type of person. And I'm probably not going to go tell the congressional oversight committees because it's going to leak out anyway. So what is my worst of all, best of all bad alternatives? Keep it under my control. If I resign, the president is going to appoint either a zealot who's going to do it even worse and cause more political backlash, or it's going to be done incompetently by less sophisticated people than my great counterintelligence staff officers. So I'm going to keep it in place, keep it quiet, keep it under heavy control. And that's where it lay until 1973, when Helms's successor, James Schlesinger, closed the program down. But that wasn't the end of the story, and we'll end the discussion here. We did find some contacts, but we did not find any kind of clear evidence of foreign support, manipulation, the worst case for the anti-war movement. Instead, it was just kind of political rhetoric and that kind of support. Maybe there was a little bit, because in counterintelligence, you never know whether you found every possible thing. You can't prove the negative in this line of business. Inside the agency, this causes a lot of controversy. A lot of people who don't want to touch this. It was known by more people than should have known it, and there was always the potential for them to leak it to the press. So we had to be very careful about keeping it inside. And here's probably the big thing that occurred. When Seymour Hersh got onto this story through, we think, congressional leaks of some sort, but it's not definitive yet, he decided to publicize it. Director Colby knew he was going to, invites him into the White House to set the record straight, to get his facts right. Hersh still gets a lot of the story wrong, and the New York Times runs it for maximum impact. Sunday, banner headline, the biggest kind of issue play you could get in the New York Times. And this is what prompts the congressional inquiries of 1975, the Rockefeller Commission out of the White House first, then the Church and the Pike committees in the Senate and the House, and all of the huge amount of controversy, of oversight, of political repercussions for the agency. We have not been the same place since. And it's one of the ironies of a program that was fashioned to be super, super secret, known only to a few, in order to answer one of the most sensitive questions in American politics at the time, and that American democracy, in its inimitable way, eventually turns it all inside out, and we become, at the end of this particular day, the most unsecret, secret organization in the world. And it's been that way ever since. That's all I have to say. Thanks.